We're sitting here in a really old neighborhood in Santa Ana, Floral Park. We've lived here for a long time, and it's an incredible evening. Actually, it's fantastic out here, and we're here to talk watches and watch stories, and what's better than that? I mean, that's fantastic. We are drinking Nika from the barrel, and unfortunately, we don't have the barrel, so don't get too excited. But we've got a bottle that, at least in theory, was poured from the barrel. No, in fact, you and I have shared more than one glass of whiskey together down the last few years, and this is a particularly great one. Whiskey of the year in 2018, sorry, and just a great Japanese whiskey. I was into watches when I was probably 16, 17 years old, and back then we actually wore watches to tell time. It was funny, but that's how old I am. But they were also, in that era, kind of a big fashion statement. And I had a friend, my best friend, who came over one day wearing this Seiko. It was just a quartz dress watch, but to me it was the classiest thing I'd ever seen. And I remember dragging him inside the house. It was getting close to Christmas, I think, and like grabbing his wrist and showing my mom and going, "This is what I want, right here, this is what I want." And I guess I didn't care about completely mimicking somebody, because I was okay if it was that exact watch. I got that watch. I still have that watch to this day in a drawer somewhere. And ever since then, I was enamored with these little machines, and be they quartz, be they mechanical. Just the fact that they were precise, that they were beautiful. And probably for me, more aesthetic than anything. I'm not the guy that can, quote every reference of, a particular manufacturer. I love watches, but I think it's probably more of an aesthetic thing for me. From that watch, I bought, it was the first watch I ever bought. Back then, it felt like the most amazing thing to buy. And I still have it somewhere too, although I couldn't put my hands on it right now probably. This gold Gucci watch with, you probably know the watch. It was kind of ubiquitous for the time. It had Roman numerals around the edge, the Gucci logo in the middle, which was kind of funny because I just stare at the Gucci logo and think I was it. And I just thought it was the next most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And from there, just a series of watches that a guy who had no money and no knowledge really could pick up for a couple $100 or $100 here and there. And so subsequently, I've got a drawer somewhere with more quartz watches, that are worth nothing, but at the time meant something to me. And then fast forward to probably the very early, the late 90s, early 2000s. And I had started to experience a little bit of success in business and wanted to, kind of do more. I was like, hey, I had a few dollars in my pocket and I just wanted to do more. And so I bought, my first sort of, quote unquote, nice watch. In fact, it's right here. At the time, Tag Heuer was, a big deal. They were heavy into motorsports. They had an aesthetic that, for whatever reason, the 90s and the early 2000s loved. But this was kind of a unique thing. It was, Tag had only acquired Heuer about 10 years earlier. And they were really kind of struggling with the brand. It wasn't going as well as they wanted the world to believe. And they were getting ready to float shares on the stock exchange, and they needed something to kind of get people jazzed up. So, and this watch actually, or this series of watches, there's 5 references, and this wasn't the first of them, but this reference actually, in my opinion, is probably the most important watch that Tag Heuer ever produced, and maybe ever will produce, because if you look at the brand right now, they lean really heavy on the past. The Monaco, still their #1 selling watch. But what they did back then was they decided to create a re-edition of the Carrera. They would never do this today, but they actually did a one-for-one re-edition, even to the point where they kept the 36 millimeter case size. Today, that would be, by most people's standards, too small, although I love wearing these watches. They kept the 36 millimeter case size. They issued it in a black dial and a silver dial, which were completely true to the original Carrera, the first iteration of the Carrera, going back to actually it's a 64 re-edition. They didn't realize that it actually first been done in 63. And so, not to get too deep into the woods, but they created the series of watches. They did 3 of them. Black dial, silver dial, like I said, but then they also cased the silver dial in an 18 karat yellow gold case. And that actually was true to the original. It wasn't solid gold back then. It would have been gold filled, but same aesthetic. And so I just fell in love with this watch. This particular one, they never did a salmon dial. This is an outlier. And this watch has actually become a bit of a unicorn, really kind of tough to find. I would love to tell you that I spent hours researching this, that I really dug deep here, and I just knew the salmon dial was going to be the one, right? The one that everybody wanted, nobody could get. But that's not how it happened at all. I walked in, I was very impulsive, and I walked up to the case at Tourneau at South Coast Plaza, and they had a display with these watches, and I went to the black dial and the silver dial, and I was like, I want those. My business partner was with me. He's like, no. You got to get that salmon dial. We called it copper at the time. Now it's salmon, right? But it was copper to us then. You got to get the copper. We didn't call them dials face. You got to get the copper face, not the black one. That's boring, and the silver one is silver. But the copper, you got to get the copper. So now it's a salmon dial, and it's really something. But so reluctantly, I bought this watch because in reality, I really wanted the black or the silver dial. But I bought this watch, and we walked out, kind of happy with ourselves because we had just, spent a couple $1,000s. I think they were probably about $1,900 at the time. It was a lot of money. So I walked out wearing the watch. Loved the watch. Wore it for every day of the week for years, and then just kind of stopped thinking about watches for a while. Family comes along, and there's just other priorities. But I was still always loved the aesthetic of watches, and so it rolled on from there. I don't think I bought another nice watch or got another nice watch because I didn't buy this next one. But when that day we were in Tourneau and we were looking at these and bought this, I saw the IWC Portuguese. Now it's called the Portugueser, but the IWC Portuguese, and to me it was just so classic. And it's, in fact, I still think it's probably one of the most well-balanced dials in the watch universe. And if it isn't already, and I happen to believe it is, it will become an icon. But if you look at IWC, there's 2 watches I think that drive that brand. Every brand kind of has their thing, and to me it's the Portuguese and then the Pilot, whether it be the Big Pilot or one of the Mark series. But so I had seen this watch, couldn't afford it, and just kind of made a mental note of it. I'm sure I told my wife about it early on, but for 20 years I wanted the watch, and for a major birthday, one of those 0 birthdays, my wife presented me with this, and it's been to every wedding, unfortunately a couple funerals, graduations. It's the watch that gets pulled out for the important occasions, because I think we breathe life into these things. Until we do, they're just pieces of metal and different materials. But once we wear them and once we live with them, they've got a life in them. It's one of the things that draws me to vintage watches, actually, is the fact that even if it's not my own, these things have lived a life. So the next pocket is a watch that actually means a great deal to me. Of all the watches I have, other than maybe the IWC, it means the most to me. And it's not a watch I wear a lot. It's not a watch, honestly, that I would have bought probably, except for the circumstances. And as you know, we started, myself and a few friends, started a, for lack of a better term, a watch enthusiast group, OC Chrono here in Orange County. And we did it kind of on a lark. I have to say, all good things happen at the bar, apparently, all good watch things. Because we were sitting at the bar at Capitol Grill over at South Coast Plaza, and Cortland and I were talking one day about just the fact that in Orange County there was not really a strong watch culture. We had started to hear about Red Bar and some of these other things, but everything seemed to be East Coast based. And if it wasn't East Coast based, it was happening in LA. But even then, it was pretty limited in LA, as you know. And so we thought, well, we should just do our own thing. I actually contacted Red Bar after that conversation. Never got a response back. I give Adam Craniotis grief over that every now and then. But we decided that it was a good idea, but that's as far as we took it. And then we met David right after that. I think it was like the next weekend. We met David, and we were kind of sharing the idea, and he actually caught on to the idea. And I'll never forget, I was actually sitting right here on a Saturday morning, and I think we had met him the Friday night before at a watch event. And he texted me, and he goes, "Were you serious about doing this?" I'm like, "Yeah, we're serious." And so, one thing led to another. We did our first meetup. It was over at Period Correct. Kind of ironic, actually, but at Period Correct. And we had 7 people. But what was exciting was 2 of them were people we'd never met before. It was like, okay, it's okay to get your friends there, but the fact that we got people we didn't know there because of Instagram, and they came, and that was pretty cool. And so we just did it again. The first time I met you was the second one, and it was at Discommon. Before Neil moved to the East Coast, he had an office in Irvine, and he offered it up. He was at the first one. He offered it up, and man, I'll tell you what, we went from a cool place, really cool place, Period Correct. Then all of a sudden we were at this cave of treasures that was Discommon. That place was unbelievable. I mean, just the environment, everything. The first one, we had 7 people. The second one, I think we had about 25 people. And it was Instagram. I was just kind of trying to figure out Instagram at the time. And so I set up a OC Chrono Instagram page. I'd put things out there. I was shocked every day. There was at least one person, "Hey, tell me more." And so that, and just word of mouth. And, before long, we were seeing 50, 60 people. If we did a special event, we'd see 100 people, and it was pretty shocking, actually. That was 3 years ago, actually, exactly 3 years ago, almost to the day, now that I think about it. So it's ironic that we're doing this. And, it's gone from what it was to what it is, which is OC Chrono is still a big thing, and yet we're now, amazing groups in San Diego. Those guys just crush it all the time. LA, Arizona. We've done some really cool things in Arizona. It's a great group of people in Arizona. And then Salt Lake City. Who'd have thunk? But they reached out to us, and they were part of another group, and they just weren't feeling it. And they said, "Hey, we like what we see, and we'd love to talk to you guys." And that's turned out to be a lot of fun. And this year we were hoping there were 2 other cities that we were getting ready to open up. We'll see how these times play out, with all that's going on in the world right now. We may push that, but so anyhow, this watch, and when I say we, there was a guy, one of the guys that was kind of there from the beginning, Dan, who was interfacing with Grand Seiko at the time, and Grand Seiko offered to do a kind of a group watch for OC Chrono. And so this is a very simple, Grand Seiko spring drive. The watch itself is not particularly unique. I suppose the only truly unique thing about it is the story. Grand Seiko did, at the factory, engrave 18 watches for us. We did this in 2018. They engraved 18 watches for us for OC Chrono. We did some special pricing, but they flew out the executive team. We did a big, we had a big party at, Kitayama in Newport Beach. Just a fantastic time. But to me, this watch represents community. So the first watch was kind of success a little bit. The second watch is family. But this watch to me is community. It was something that we all achieved together. We created this group that became enough for a brand like Grand Seiko to be even remotely interesting. And to this day, we have a phenomenal relationship with Grand Seiko. They are the absolute best to us, and it's hard not to love what they do. When you get to know the leadership team at Grand Seiko USA, you start to realize it's a very different breed of people. They've come from many of the major Swiss brands, but their assignment appears to be a little different than everybody else. And I describe it kind of as commando marketing. I mean, there's nothing off the table when you speak with them. There's nothing they won't consider. I mean, they're not unintelligent. They want to do things that make business sense. But within reason, there's not much that they won't listen to and pay attention to. And you're right. The fact that they were willing to engage with the community when they did and the way they did means everything to us. And since then, and partly because of Grand Seiko, but other brands are now paying attention and engaging. And when I talk about the community, I mean, the community is not just watch lovers. It's not just collectors or the purchaser of these things, the buyers of these things. It's those people. It's the manufacturers. It's the dealers, the vintage dealers, the pre-owned dealers. It's everybody. Because if you think about it, it's one of the most symbiotic relationships, that is in the watch world. One could not exist without the others. I'm 100% convinced that one could not exist without the others. And so we are the community, all of us. And in a time like this, actually, it's important to pay attention to that, because you will see dealers that aren't dealers after this is all over. You will see perhaps, and I hope not, but you will see brands that may cease to exist after all of this, or not exist in the ways that they did before. One thing I'm convinced that we'll all see after this is we will see brands that, like Grand Seiko, have been willing or are now willing to engage more directly with the collector community. I think we need them and they need us more than ever right now. That IWC, I think, wrecked me. I think that at that point I became a real watch person. That Heuer I had bought because I had the money and I liked the watch, and I liked watches. The IWC, though, kind of changed something in me, and I became a watch person, really, at that point. And so from there, of course, you get on all the websites and all the blogs, and you read all the magazines, and you talk to all the people, and you start to kind of try and figure out what's your thing, And for me, I made a lot of mistakes in buying watches that really weren't me. Things that don't exist in the, if you can call it a collection, the collection right now, and probably never will again. But I really started to gravitate towards sports watches and tool watches. And in certain cases, those are almost synonymous, I suppose. They didn't used to be, but maybe they're becoming more so now. And so the first tool watch / sports watch that I really gravitated towards was the Speedmaster. To me, the Speedmaster is the most American Swiss watch ever made, and it's all because of the space program. But here you had this watch that was originally made for, drivers and ultimately morphed into something that was being used by NASA and went to the moon. And I just loved that story, but more than the story, I loved the watch. And I felt like anything that, could be on an astronaut's wrist and survive could certainly handle my wrist. And aesthetically, it was pleasing to me, and something about pushing buttons on a chronograph, was always something that interested me. So I remember one day, you and I sitting at a sushi bar, and Maynard was there too. And, I don't know if you asked me or if I just offered it up, kind of my ideal Speedmaster. At the time, I didn't really understand all the references and everything. I still can't really claim to, but I said, if you could find me a applied logo, dot over 90, and there was, I think, one other criteria that I just can't even remember right now.
Long indices, I think. Yeah.
And you instantly, you being you, said, okay, you need the 145.012. That's your watch. And if you get it in this kind of time frame, it's going to be a little less expensive than if you try and do the other. And so and you and I think Maynard at the time, you guys had one. And so I think a week or two later, coincidentally, you had one, right? No, I mean, it was fortuitous actually, and so a week or two later, you're putting this thing in front of me, and I'm falling in love, and I'm sure writing a check on the spot, and that watch, it's moved on, but it's one of those watches that you think, not sure it should have moved on. I mean, I like what I replaced it with, but so the Speedmaster thing for me was big, and I don't know how many Speedmasters. There's a lot of Speedmasters. Sure. I own one Speedmaster now. It's not that one, sadly. It's a more pedestrian 145.022 from the mid 80s or something. But it was the first one I ever bought, and I love the watch, and I kept the watch. But then I kind of gravitated into, I never thought I was a Rolex guy. In fact, I remember telling you a million times, looks great on your wrist. Looks great on everybody's wrist, but and I love the watch, but it's just not my watch.
Right.
And a friend one day, I was in Arizona, drinking coffee in the morning, and reading the watch blogs, and a friend texted me and goes, "I've got a 16610 Submariner. If you know anybody that you think might be interested in buying it, let me know." And I don't know why, but I said, "Well, I might be." We were coming back to California a few days later, and so I met for a drink or so with him, and he brought the watch, and I walked away with the watch. And that was my introduction, really. You had introduced me before, but that was my first hands-on, on the wrist, now you own it, introduction to a Rolex. And I thought, this actually isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. My wrist isn't burning up. I'm okay. I had just, within a couple years, become a watch guy, in my mind, right? I was now a watch guy. And I think there's this curve that we go through with Rolex in particular. It's not true of any other brand, in my opinion, where it's, I'm a watch guy, I'm too cool for that because that's what everybody wants, right?
Yes.
And that was me. I'm sure it was me. Even though at the time I didn't recognize that, that was me. And then I started to admire a little bit more, and then got the thing on my wrist. But yeah, that was the thing that kept me away from it. But then to continue the curve, then you start to understand Rolex maybe a little bit. And I still didn't understand vintage Rolex. You had tried really hard to help me understand it at that point, but I still didn't understand it. And but I understood that the thing on my wrist was good. Now, I am typically a guy that thinks if the new version is good, the old version's probably better. That's just me. I'm that way about a lot of things. I don't drive a vintage car, but if I could snap my fingers today, it would be some 911 from the past. I saw a 912 the other day that just blew my mind, actually. And then you sent me a picture, actually, of a 912 that almost was identical to the one that I had seen only a few weeks before. But anyhow, I mean, to me, if I'm going to buy a Porsche, if I'm going to buy a 911, I'm going to buy a vintage 911. If I've kind of morphed into that guy, and so from there, I kind of got the bug. I don't buy a ton of Rolexes because one of the great things about a Submariner is a Submariner is a Submariner is a Submariner. I love the fact, and this is true of the Speedmaster too, in a world where so many companies are remaking their archives, they're going back to their history and they're remaking these things, and while they're beautiful and I like them, they're still kind of contrived. But the Submariner has been made continuously since the 50s. Same with the Speedmaster, since the 50s. And so these are iconic watches. Nobody's had to remake them because they've never stopped making them. And so, the vintage thing kind of took hold. Amongst other things, this is just an example, really. There's no great story here. This is an example of kind of where my head's at these days. I had it in my mind that I still wasn't going to be a Rolex guy, right? I had a Submariner. That's all I had. But to me, Tudor was like, okay, you're not a Rolex guy if you buy a Tudor Submariner. That's okay. And obviously, these vintage Tudor subs are just beautiful. They're gorgeous. And so I discovered that want to buy a watch. My good friend Ken Jacobs had this incredible blue dial, blue bezel, early sub, and I was kind of taken by it. And so I went up to West Hollywood and paid them a visit. And this is what I love about the dealer part of the watch community. There's only a couple folks in that community that I know well enough to feel really comfortable with. Ken obviously is one, and you're the other. And so I show up at Want to Buy a Watch, and this Tudor sub was, I don't know, it's probably a $12,000 watch at the time. And I remember pulling out, looking at it, and go, yep, that's what I want. And then I remember Mike Schmidt, the manager at Want to Buy a Watch, another really great friend. He's been a supporter of what we do in the community for a very long time. And he said, Mike, he said, it is a beautiful watch. He said, and I'll sell you the watch if you want to buy the watch. He goes, but I'm going to tell you, Tudor subs right now are a little soft. And this watch, to me, feels a little overpriced. Because he knows that, for me, I'm all about the watch, but I also want value. I don't want to be crazy stupid with my money. It's interesting because the average person out there, right? The average non-watch person doesn't really pay attention to watches. And yet, it's not unusual to be sitting somewhere and somebody just say, hey, that's a nice watch. They don't know what they're looking at. It could be a Seiko, it could be a unicorn Rolex. I mean, it's just, you just don't know. I would say that this whole thing, just in general, I'm in my 50s and I've got more great friends because of this whole thing, and have made more great friends in the last 3 years because of this whole thing than I did in the 50 years before it. So yes, I mean, all over the place, literally all over the place. Where it happens the most is airplanes. I don't know what it is. I guess it's because you're in close proximity and stuff. But that's where people, notice watches. And it's always when you really don't want to talk to anybody. I don't know if you've ever gotten on an airplane and for whatever reason, either it was a rough night the night before or you're just not in the mood, but you're just not looking for a conversation with somebody. I don't care who they are. Yeah. And it's always that moment that somebody looks at your amazing, vintage 5513 and says, is that a Tag Heuer? It happens all the time. And there's that indignant part of me that just wants to take the Sky Mall magazine and whack them in the face with it. And then there's that part of me that feels the need to engage and explain, and that's what I do. The other thing we were talking about was the experience with that Explorer. So we were at Want to Buy a Watch. Yes. Long story short, they talked me out of that Tudor Submariner and talked me into this. And at the time, The Explorer 2 wasn't getting a lot of love, wasn't getting a lot of attention, but they had one with a particularly amazing dial. And the case is average. The case is, it's polished. It's not overly polished, but polished. But the dial was gorgeous. And, you know, this is what I love about your part of the community. It's when people can be honest enough and know their client well enough, right? To be able to go, you know, I know you like this watch, but I want you to consider something else. It was less expensive. You know, they'd have made more money on the other watch, and yet they were willing to tell me that from a value standpoint, that wasn't the watch. And from a style standpoint and just my aesthetic and the things I gravitate towards, that would be. That was maybe a year and a half ago, and every day with that watch has been nothing but a pleasure. You mentioned that I've got a history of kind of moving watches around. All of a sudden, I do a lot less of that. And I do a lot less of that because there's just some incredible things that I've started to realize what I like, I think, is what's happened. Yeah. Yeah, what follows that is kind of it's really a cool story. And it's another story about the community, I suppose. So, you know, there are these new Rolex sports models that are, well, almost any Rolex sports model now, especially stainless steel, possible to get. And there's a friend that I made in the watch community. He's part of the San Diego group. He and I became close. He was working down in San Diego for an AD and not particularly happy with that AD. I think some of their business practices really weren't, you know, that great. And so he just wasn't thrilled. And at the same time, another good friend who had been the boutique manager at a very, very high-end boutique at South Coast Plaza, had left that brand and was going to open the Rolex boutique in San Diego for Fortain. People in the vintage Rolex world know Fortain up in Carmel. Josh up there is, you know, another amazing, you know, vintage Rolex guy. But they were opening up a boutique down in San Diego. And, you know, the friend who had left the other boutique had asked me if I knew some people that might be good for his team at this new boutique. And so literally all I did was put a couple people together. But it helped him build his team. And so one day I think I was working out in this yard actually doing something. And I got a text on my cell phone. It was a picture. It was almost like one of these ransom photos, but it was a picture of the new Pepsi GMT on the Jubilee bracelet, and it was there was a Post-it note that said, "Would you like to come down and join us for a Pepsi?" And I thought about that, and I thought, "What the fuck is he talking about?" And so I texted him. I said, "What do you mean?" So finally, I wasn't getting the hint. I wasn't being particularly bright. And he texted me. He said, "We'd like to do you a favor. You've done some good things for us here, and you know, we'd like to offer this watch to you if you'd be interested." Now, in any other universe, somebody telling you that they'll let you come buy this $9,000 or $10,000 watch as a favor to you seems a bit crazy. But in the world of Rolex, much like other brands, Porsche, Hermes, you know, some of these things, I mean, you literally, you know, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you just can't get the watch. And so I wasn't going to say no. And the very next day I was in the car on my way to San Diego to buy that watch. And so that was the next, you know, the next purchase. And then from there, you know, I'm still telling myself I'm not a Rolex guy. You know, it's like, okay, I've got three, but I'm not a Rolex guy. And these three have come in a period of 4 months, 5 months maybe. I probably at that point have spent about $27,000, $28,000 on Rolexes in a really short period of time. Now I was selling things, Carol, if you're listening to this, I was selling things to make all that happen. But you know, it was after that I thought, okay, maybe I'm a Rolex guy, but I don't really think I'm a Rolex guy. So it was probably, you know, a couple weeks after that, a friend of mine in Central California sends me a text. He goes, "You've got this Panerai GMT that I just love. I think it's a great watch. would you be interested in a straight swap for my 14060 Swiss only dial Submariner? And I'm thinking, gosh, you know, I've got a Submariner, but it's got that date and that date window and stuff, and you know, so it's not quite the same thing. And within about 30 seconds, I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so there was number 4, I guess, and it's just rolled on from there. And then, you know, so in keeping with this, and this is, as you know, because you sourced this for me, I've always wanted, and when I say always, I mean in the year and a half that I've been a Rolex guy, quote unquote, I've wanted a 5513. I wasn't looking for, you know, anything outlandish. I just really wanted an honest watch. I've got, as you can tell from the two, I've got kind of a, you know, a thing for lume. I love that warm lume. I hate to use the word creamy lume because it gets overused and I don't know, it just sounds kind of perverted. But I love that vibe, that aesthetic, and so, you know, this was the next addition to, you know, to that, and I'm obviously super happy with it. So that that original Seiko, that quartz Seiko that my parents got me for Christmas, the first watch that I ever showed any interest in. Got it Christmas Day, and I think it was a day after Christmas. My brother, he's younger than me, and you know, we were just kids. I was 17. That probably makes him 13, 14. We're driving up to LA, and we're going up to buy. I think we're going up to buy the concert tickets, and I've got this old 240Z, which, by the way, today I wish to God I had, because now I've got the money, I could have restored it. Back then it was just a headache. Driving up there, and my hands are on the wheels, but I love this watch so much that every time I kind of do this, I do this, and I catch myself, I'm just staring at the watch, almost like the old-fashioned version of texting while you're driving, because I'm not watching the road. And all of a sudden, before I know it, we hit the dirt. So on the 405, there's like some iconic spots along the 405, right? There's the big statue. Used to be a golfer, but now it's the Porsche guy, right? Yes. But that thing's been there since probably the 70s. But there's also on the other side, on the inland side, there is the Goodyear blimp. Yeah. And it was right at the Goodyear blimp that we went off the 405 into the dirt, and the ditch is pretty deep. We almost went all the way down. I don't know how I managed to stop the car, but yeah, staring at a watch almost got me and my brother killed. I still feel bad to this day about that.
And you were telling me you bribed him to not tell your parents?
I did, yeah. I don't remember what I gave him, but I know I gave him something, because typical brothers, I mean, we couldn't wait to get home and tell on each other. I mean, it's still kind of that way, actually, now that I think about it. So, yeah.